If you're a professional brewer, you know how frustrating it can be when you go to place a yeast order and what you're looking for is out of stock. Well, Imperial Yeast is here to help by guaranteeing that commercial orders up to 20 liters of 10, yes, 10 of their most popular strains will ship free if they're not in stock when you place your order. Some of these strains include A38 Juice for those hazy IPAs, A07 Flagship, a classic in clean American styles, L13 Global, which is said to be one of the world's most popular lager strains, A44 Viking for your warm fermented beers, and so many more. So in addition to pitching right with the highest quality yeast on the market, they're promising that yeast will be ready when you need it or shipping is on them. Whether you're a pro or a home brewer, if you haven't tried Imperial Yeast in your brewery, it's time to up your game. You can check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and place your commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. Way back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, America was experiencing a huge influx of European immigrants seeking greater economic prosperity, bringing with them important aspects of their homeland, one of which was beer, thankfully. Well, the Germans were perhaps one of, if not the more influential cultures on American brewing, which led to the massive rise in popularity of pale lager. Unable to abide by the constraints of brewing such beers, American brewers came up with their own spin on the style that relied on the use of a pretty unique ingredient. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to talk about the use of flaked maize, also known as corn, in cream ale is contributor Andy Carter.
Hey, Marsh. Yeah. I was really excited to venture into cream ale. A lot of my friends, especially home brewers around here, started really getting into it a few years ago, and they're just making fantastic examples. And everyone says you got to look at the corn, you got to balance the corn with the flavor of the recipe. So this was a really fun experiment.
Absolutely. I love cream ale, and in part because I love pale lager, and they're so similar. Now, I've heard a number of theories as to where the moniker for this style came from, though it seems there's really no good historical information on that. It's just guesses. I'm sure I'm not the only one who in my early days in craft beer and brewing presumed cream ale was in some way creamy, only to discover that that's very far from the case. We're going to dig a bit more into the history of this style, the use of corn when brewing it, and of course the results of the experiment you referred to on this topic. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up in August of 2021 is Eno Beer brewer and advocate Alex Liberati of Denver, Colorado. Now, for those who haven't heard of Eno Beer, which is spelled O-E-N-O beer, it's a sort of wine beer hybrid that gets up to 49% of its fermentables from grapes. And Alex has been featured in large publications like Forbes magazine talking about Eno Beer and his passion for advocating for this style. It's going to be a really killer session. If you'd like to be a part of it, be sure to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, August 27th, 2021. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is that you listen to podcasts that allow you to leave ratings and reviews, we really would appreciate it. By doing that, those who haven't heard of us yet can more easily find the show. Plus, we really like reading what you think about us. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. A listener named Mike wrote in with feedback on episode 84, where we talked about Maris Otter Malt. Mike said, I've been brewing for a while, but just got into the podcast thing about a week ago. I know this is an old episode, but I've got some feedback on it. I'm a farmer myself, as well as a crop consultant for a large hop grower. It was nice to hear people talking about farmers, crops, and agronomics in regards to brewing. Every single kernel of barley and every single cone of hops is grown and cared for by somebody for months before it's processed in some way and sent off to brewers around the world. Without farmers, there is no beer. As a brewer, I know crop yield isn't everything. Flavor and aroma and other characteristics matter. But without people willing to pay for those attributes, my perspective as a farmer would be that yield matters most. Coughing up a few extra bucks is key to keeping these malts we love around for years to come.
Oh, that's amazing, and I don't think I can speak more highly of this letter in, because I think sometimes it's easy to think, oh, everything comes from the homebrew shop. It's just always going to be there. It's always going to be available, but that's never the case. The market forces, really what he gets to, the farming forces of this. Everything you hear every year. Well, this hop is overplanted, so that price of that's going to go down. Well, whereas one hop, you got only 10% of the yield, and that doesn't even go to the flavor of it, right? That's just we yielded this much from the farm. So it was really good to hear that from him. I thank him for writing in about that, because some of what we're seeing today, I think what we're seeing today at least, is more and more craft malt, and you know what? That's going to be more expensive than a bag of Rar or a bag of Briess, right?
Exactly.
That's going to carry a tax, but I want that flavor. I'm here for that flavor, and so I'm more than willing to pay that extra cost.
Exactly. There's this, I think, propensity for people in craft beer or home brewing, or brewing in general, to kind of dog on big beer or stuff like that, stuff that's not specifically small and crafty. Those farmers that are supplying you with all of the malt that you're getting, all of the hops that you're getting, are also supplying those big brewing companies. And as much as you might hate them, they wouldn't have the money to finance all of the experimentation that has led to the development of these new hops that you love if it weren't for them getting money from these big breweries. That's one of the conversations I've had with maltsters and with hop growers. It's just the reality of things, and so it's part of the reason that I don't spew so much hate. Mike, thank you so much for the feedback. I agree that sometimes it is worth dropping a little more coin on certain ingredients like craft malts, not just to support small businesses, but to ensure that unique products stay on the market. As a resident of the Central Valley of California, I know you're in California as well, Andy, where a good amount of the almonds and produce consumed around the world is grown. I feel like I was kind of raised with a stronger appreciation for farmers and those who work in agriculture. So amen. Thanks to all you growers out there. All right, if you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. I'm not much of a fan of fruited beer, though there is one exception, sour beer. I feel like the acidity and even funkiness lend itself really well to fruit additions. Well, Cincinnati, Ohio's Urban Artifact is known for their fruited sours, which they refer to as Midwest fruit tarts, one of which is their Operation Plowshare, a blackberry sour that I believe is made with a touch of vanilla.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Look at it. It's pretty, yeah.
Yeah, it's so pretty.
Look at it. Oh, it's so pretty.
It's dark. Yeah. Let's stop sniffing it before we taste it. We become what we hate.
That's good.
Oh, yeah?
A good sour.
Oh, that's a yummy sour.
That's good.
We do both like sours.
And it's not like super tart.
That's really good. What's the flavor behind the sour, though, right? Is it cherry?
I don't know. Yeah.
Kind of, maybe a little bit cherry?
It's good. Very nice.
Yeah, it's a real good sour. God, I love sour beer.
I would drink this.
You are drinking it. I'm watching you drink it.
It's good.
Oh, it's so good.
That's kind of something on the end.
Yeah, it's called sour. Is it sour? Is that flavor sour to you?
No. Something.
Did you taste a little bit of sour? Did you? Oh, that's really good. That is so good. I think the flavor is cherry, but I'm not super good with fruits.
No, either am I.
My diet does not include a ton of fruit. Beer, red meat, and eggs. That's me. I give this a solid 3.7 jerseys.
That's it?
Oh, it's like a golf score. It's low. It's good.
Well, then I'll give it a birdie.
So good. So good. So good. So good. I love this beer so much. Fruity without being overwhelming. A nice tartness. A hint of fresh baked bread. I'm absolutely with the guys on this one. I loved it. It was so good.
Yeah. I mean, I was impressed. They really like this one.
Yeah.
And sometimes they can be a little, one way or the other. I think they've really grown accustomed to, or have a palate now for, the acidic, funky, fruity stuff. Maybe not funky, but more fruity, big flavors. And it sounded like this has great flavors, and happy to hear that it wasn't too acidic, really had the good fruit punch to it.
Yeah. This is, I really would like to, Cincinnati is not necessarily a place I think I'm going to find myself very often, but I would love to visit Urban Artifact. I got a few of these beers sent to me by Zach Otting out of Cincinnati, Ohio, which I really appreciate you sending so much stuff to us. But he sent me a few beers from Urban Artifact, and I'm telling you, these folks know what's up. They're doing a great job. So Zach, thanks again for sending in so many beers. And Urban Artifact, you're kicking ass. Great job. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage you feel like sending in reviewed on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. When we're back from this break, our focus will be on the use of flaked maize in cream ale. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort, from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature, in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. A common sentiment among self-proclaimed craft beer and brewing aficionados is that using certain adjuncts in beer is universally bad and produces a lower quality product. One such adjunct that has received ample amounts of hate over the years is corn, likely due to its use in certain mass-market lagers. However, brewing with corn is nothing new, and it's viewed by many as being a necessary ingredient in cream ale.
Yeah, so there's a style, and it's in the BJCP guidelines, and I'm sure everyone's heard of it before, but to go back a little bit, cream ale kind of starts as it's one of these more traditional American styles. When brewing in America started getting off the ground, it became its own thing. And, initially in the United States, brewing was an English tradition, but we started borrowing things from German traditions and things as people immigrated. And one of the things that changed in like the 1800s, 1900s kind of time frame was a move away from darker, heavier beers to lighter, crisper, just more thirst quenching, drinkable beers. But, not farmhouse in the sense of those ingredients, though that does happen, and not the phenolicness, but, clean, right?
Yeah.
The cleanness. And I think one thing you see here is actually it's a technological development, right? Because to use maize or corn, you need enzymatic power, right? And that's how malts got better and could use more adjuncts. So really the style comes from a kind of a shift from, one way of brewing to another, more thirst quenching, more reliable drinking way too.
Yeah, I was doing a little background research on cream ale in general, mostly because I still want to know where this name came from. And part of me wonders if it wasn't because you like creamed corn or so let's just call it cream ale, or if it wasn't. I read one theory that it was because the word cream it's delectable. It makes it sound like it's higher. Yeah, like it's going to be a high quality thing. It's creamy, and then you pour out this crystal clear lager tasting beer. I think it's kind of funny. But one of the things that I read was that it was the development of cream ale in general really was influenced, by German immigrants who came over and brought their brewing traditions with them, and they were producing these delicious pilsners. Well, these American brewers who didn't necessarily have the resources available to them, which makes sense to me, right? Sure. To control fermentation temperatures and such, developed what we now refer to as this hybrid style, right? A hybrid style meaning that it's fermented. I believe cream ale tends to be fermented slightly warmer, but with a lager strain, and that is how kind of cream ale came about. I could not find like where flaked maize or where corn worked into that scenario. Like what is it about corn that these guys were like, well, let's just throw some of that in there? It must have been something they were doing prior to the immigration thing.
Yeah, I think what you see there is the ability to understand really what happens at a mash and looking at the enzymatic power and then drying a beer out, right?
Yeah.
Because malt has some residual body. I think that's why a lot of people really like beer for its residual mouthfeel, right? It's something there on the palate, and I think this is one topic I just love talking about and love thinking about how this happens, because imagine you make a fruit beverage, it dries out a lot. You have a thin body is left over, but malt leaves a little bit over. So to counterbalance that, to dry it out a little bit more, make it a little bit crisper, other than using hops or other ingredients, is to use something like corn, in this case, flaked maize, or just straight corn sugar to dry the beer out a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. It makes sense to me. Another kind of hypothesis that I was toying around with is that at the time, I mean, it was the 18th century or so. Long before that, there was whiskey being made in certain parts of America, and they're using huge portions of corn. I mean, corn whiskey was a thing, and in order to make whiskey, you do a brewer's mash, basically, and so perhaps it was just kind of this thing that grew out of that in some way, or at least was influenced by it. I don't know for certain, but I'm glad it worked out because I love cream ale, and to me there are very few styles where I'm just dead set on it. You gotta kind of have to have this in there. Cream ale, I don't care if you ferment it with an ale strain or a lager strain or this, but it has to have flaked or corn in it of some sort, whether that's corn sugar or because that's what kind of defined this style, or at least it does today, it seems.
Yeah, I think absolutely. If I was hard pressed, I looked online. I looked at a lot of professional recipes and a lot of homebrew recipes from books and things. You're hard pressed to not see corn. Yeah, it really just becomes part of it, and that's why I really wanted to delve into using it or not using it and see what difference we could tell. So yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about flaked maize or corn in general. Obviously, some reasons for using it. I know that there are areas of the world where this is not accurate, but typically corn is going to be a bit less expensive than barley malt.
Yeah. I mean, barley malt itself has a much more rigorous process, because in the making of barley malt, you have to start with unmalted barley, and the process of malting is, while it's been mechanized and scaled and everything, it's still not cheap, and it's a long process. It's a multi-day process, and it's got has some loss to it, right? So the inputs are never going to always come out the same, and so with corn, there is a process of flaking it or gelatinizing it, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the subtleties of barley and barley is just not as used as much, right? Wheat is a huge crop all over the world. I mean, in bread and so many dishes, and corn, at least in the United States, North America, is a huge crop. I think I was looking, it's got to be one of the biggest things we make in terms of the acreage that's used. So it's available, right? So that cost will come down. Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons for it, and I think that's why and like to your point of whiskey making. I think corn, especially in the United States, it's abundant, it's available. Yeah. And so if we can use it, why not? Yeah. That's kind of where, again, I have to believe that it's abundance, that it's just sheer availability, and the fact that it does contribute highly fermentable sugars. I mean, that would influence these brewers to, hey, we don't want to make these all malt beers because they cost us an arm and a leg. We can charge a little bit less. I can see that conversation happening. We could charge a little bit less if we use 20% or 10% of this corn that we've got, such
such access to.
And especially if it makes the beer more attractive to the end consumer, right?
Yeah.
If they want the 20 or 30%, and now that changes the balance of the final product, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it does to me too. So let's talk a little bit about the impact using corn in general is said to have on a certain perceptible characteristics. And one of the things that I always before I really got into using corn myself, we've all kind of been there, and you join the bandwagon of haters who don't want to use any adjuncts like that. But one of the things is, a common off flavor that people like to throw around and say that they perceive often is dimethyl sulfide, which is DMS, which is commonly said to smell like creamed corn or canned corn.
Yeah.
I don't perceive it that way. And the times that I've actually done real flavor standards where I dose a pale lager with DMS, it smells to me like warm ketchup, which is not pleasant. But in my experiences using Flaked Maize, which I've used fairly decent charges of, I don't get a very corny aroma out of it. Now that may be because the hops are covering it up or something else is going on, but I don't notice a huge. Now I've not done the comparison. We'll talk about the experiment later, but I've not done a comparison where I've found a cream ale, for example, to have a corny characteristic to it.
Yeah, and I think there's two routes there, and one is the base ingredients we're using. Is it a corn that's just been basically kind of blanded out and it's very generic, so maybe it's not really adding flavor by design, or is it the levels of corn we're using that we're putting into the beer and it's not altering it? There's kind of goes both ways, and I think what's cool about adjunct beers in general, non-barley ingredients in general, is there's so much more about where it comes from and how it was made. Yeah. Versus just, hey, I got a sack of two-row that's just going to be my, that's my sack of two-row I use for the next 6 months of brewing, and that's it. These other ingredients have a little more heritage to them, or at least you're going to have to think a little bit further about how to use them. Yeah.
No, it's a good point. And my experience when it comes to the flavor impact corn has is about the same. To me, it does. Again, this is in part influenced by what I expect when I use corn based on what I've learned about, what corn does to beer, but I don't taste corn in the beers where I use it. One of the areas, and I don't know how unique this is, but one of the areas where I like to use Flaked Maize is in brewing higher alcohol, like double IPA, because it doesn't have much of a contribution in my experience, doesn't seem to have much of a contribution on mouthfeel or body, but you do get those extra gravity points out of it. So you can get that greater alcohol level without contributing much of anything else to it.
Yeah, much like people use dextrose or corn sugar.
Exactly.
That just dissolves immediately into the beer. It doesn't add color, doesn't add flavor. It's adding, and especially in the case of corn sugar, when it goes into the boil kettle, all your whole processes just slide to the right of the schedule, so to speak, right? Your mash tun doesn't need to be as big. All these things get a lot easier, and then there's it's just easier to process in the end.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. So what is your experience using corn, just anecdotally, without getting into the experiment yet, in terms of these kind of perceptible qualities of beer?
Yeah, I kind of get the same kind of feel for you. That's there's not much of a change. I'm definitely noticing the most one important measurement is the objective sugar content. The beer, does increase. It's not just like rice hulls or something that's just neutral, right? It's increasing that. One thing I don't see, because we're trying to talk about the different ways of putting corn in. One is the flaked variety. I see when I use flaked ingredients like oats or wheat that they dissolve a lot faster, and the corn kind of just sits there. So it's interesting that the corn itself, while adding gravity, isn't dissolving. Like the corn sticks around, and I think that goes to the husk and the corn cob material is not necessarily just like disappearing, right? It's still in the beer, so it's not dissolving as much. That was interesting.
Yeah.
In terms of flavor and everything, I think I can taste it if I know it's in the beer, kind of thing. And I think in general for me, it does dry the beer out a bit. It makes it a little crisper, and especially the ones I've had. I've not made as many at home as my friends do around here, where they really got focused on cream ale and blonde ale specifically. They really wanted to refine their lower alcohol clean beers.
Yeah.
I just noticed they were snappier. I just noticed this, that was kind of what I was getting was that kind of just clean, dry finish.
Yeah, that snappiness is a perfect descriptor there. That is what I think I get out of it as well.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to using corn in the brewing process, typically there's two forms that corn typically comes in for brewers. One of them, you can go by corn grits. And if you're going to use corn grits in your brewing, you have to do something a little special to prepare those grits, that corn, for the mash, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's called gelatinizing, or freeing the starches. So remember Mash 101. If you do barley malt, it not only has long chain sugars that you're going to convert in the mash, but it has a cell wall, it has a husk, and that's part of milling it. Right, milling it gets you in there to access the starches and everything.
Right.
Unfortunately, or fortunately for malt, the temperatures of mashing are also gelatinizing temperatures, but not all plant matter gelatinizes at those temperatures.
Right.
Hence the cereal mash. You have to boil it maybe above the temperature of the mash to access the starches that now are enzymes from the barley malt are going to attack and break down for you.
Exactly. And for the most part, a cereal mash, whether you're doing it with corn or some other cereal grain out there, you're going to add your grits to the water, and then you're going to put in just a handful of milled barley malt. And that barley malt will provide the enzymes needed for that the starches from the corn to break down into fermentable sugars. Then you can go ahead and add that to your mash. And I think that's typically the way most people are using grits. But there's a far easier way to use corn in your brewing, and it's the focus of this show. It is flaked maize or flaked corn, which, yes, it is cornflakes, though if you go out and you buy a box of Kellogg cornflakes, you're going to get a version of cornflakes that have been, there's all kinds of vitamins and such added because it's a breakfast cereal.
Yeah. And it's a stabilized product. It's been ready to go. It's been dried and color tested and everything. So, I mean, yes, you could do it. I think I've seen people do this.
I know
on the
I've
internet.
seen people do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So but we want to have a clean, 100% flaked maize product. That's what homebrew shops sell. I bet you could even buy them yourself in other places, but that's an easy one to get. And yeah, like Marshall said, these are things that have been essentially pre-gelatinized for you and then put into a flaked form, so it's easy to weigh. It's not, it's processed, right? It's minimally processed in this case, so it's just an easy way to add the corn to your mash, and you don't have to even think about it anymore. It's just ready to go, ready to be converted by the barley in your mash done.
Exactly, and I believe the process, for people who brew with rice, which I think is another one that is perfectly valid, and I've done many times. In fact, the very first cream ale I ever made, all grain style, had both rice and corn in it. You might hear torrefied wheat or torrefied rice. So I believe the process for making flaked maize, I may be wrong on this, is that it's actually they torrefy the corn first, and then they run it through rollers. So that torrefication is what releases those starches and allows it so that you can just add them directly to your mash. If you're asking me, just go buy flaked maize. It's super cheap. Cheaper. I think it's cheaper than most barley malts, and you can get a whole bunch of it, and it doesn't really go bad, at least in my experience. People get concerned about shelf life and such. I still have some sitting on the shelf that's probably 2 years old, and I'll still use it. Doesn't bother me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. There has been a little bit of a run on the corn market these days due to people making other beverages at home. But you will be able to find your flake maize soon enough in your local homebrew supply shop.
Yeah. Or hop on Amazon, morebeer.com. They've always had flaked maize. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the technical specifications of when you're using corn. We know that barley malt has a range of there's this concept of points per pound per gallon, and barley malt is very predictable, and we're able to very easily predict what our OG is going to be based on the amount of malt that we're using and the water that we're using. What are some of the specs for flaked maize?
Yeah. So in general, if you go off the More webpage or wherever the supplier has, we're looking at a points per pound per gallon. So you can use these points that the beer you want to make over the of the pounds you're going to add of this, you would get 1.039 starting gravity. So if I added a pound of this to a pound of water to a gallon of water, if it dissolved correctly, right, theoretically you get 1039. Yeah. It's a little higher than malt. Right, I think malt's coming in around 1035, 1036 is what I have in my my kind of in my back of my head calculation. So it's a little denser in terms of the sugar content you'll get out of malt. Yeah,
which is wonderful. That's exactly what these. So not only does it cost less typically, but you're actually getting a little bit more fermentable sugar out of it as well. And so and on top of that, the sugar that you get out of corn doesn't have the maltotriose, doesn't have the stuff that typical brewer's yeast is going to leave behind. Right, it's going to ferment almost all the way out. So again, you're boosting that alcohol at a lower cost. You can see why this would be attractive to early brewers who are just trying to get this crisp, easy drinking, refreshing beer, for gold miners and such.
Absolutely.
In terms of color contribution, this is one of the palest grains that you're going to use in a beer. It's 0.8 Lovabond. It's not going to contribute much in the way of color at all.
Yeah. And Lovibond scale came about through different means. I've read different histories of it, but for malt, it's about the color you get from kilning it, right? So if I have a lightly kilned malt, it's lower, and guess what? The corn really isn't kilned in any way. It's just heated to gelatinized, so it's very light.
Right.
There is no husk to no Maillard reactions are going to occur to create flavors like that. So yeah, super light.
Yeah. What are your what's your understanding, or what do you recall? When you started brewing cream ale or using corn in your brewing as being kind of the maximum recommended usage rate?
Yeah, I've seen numbers all over the place, and it's definitely it's starting at 5 to something percent. I think I've seen 15 to 20, but inevitably the 20% rule. Don't go over something. Don't add something worse than that. 10 to 20%. Always says the fear will be you'll modify the beer's flavor too much,
right,
and it'll be thin, too low in body. You'll start tasting the corn, so to speak. Something else will occur. So I think starting around 10 is probably good. Maybe the max is 10, but 10 to 20, I don't think I've seen above 20.
Yeah. That's the same with me. What I recall, doing my research when I was looking into starting to make cream ale was don't use any more than 10%, lest ye, produce a beer that tastes like a can of corn. I've used far more than 10%, and I've yet to get that. I don't know who comes up with these rules and recommendations. But I would say that, typically if you're using it to, for the purposes of imparting a corny flavor, you could probably, which again, I think that's going to be difficult, but you could probably get away with 25-30% corn, especially if you're using one like a Mecca Great Estate malt or a root shoot malt, like a craft malt that has a bit more character to it, a little bit more oomph. That corn might actually balance that out a little bit and make just a really refreshing, crisp beer.
Well, it'll be interesting, and it's something I'm looking at in the outside the podcast for the website is, we're looking at these craft malts. Their diastolic power is a little lower than the really, fully converted Ferrari raw and Brice malts, right? So when you add corn, you have to balance out that its maltability, right? It's how fermentable it is. Diastolic power, balances, right? So then, the whole beer's, I would imagine the whole beer flavor is going to change, right? So with that diastolic power. So it'll be interesting as you bring those craft malts up to add more malt flavor, how much more corn is going to affect that.
Yeah, I agree with you. Now, obviously we talked a little bit about the DMS fear, that, you're just going to, if you use corn, it's going to make it feel or you're going to perceive what you would get from DMS, even though it's just corn. I don't think that's true. I've yet to experience that. But one of the arguments against brewing with corn in general, whether it's in cream ale or not, is that, you're going to add a corny flavor to beer. The other thing that I've read a lot of, and this is just an argument that I think is so banal, is that it cheapens beer. It cheapens beer if you use any adjuncts that are less expensive than barley malt.
Yeah, and that just comes from, I think, the history. We live in, it's the early 2020s right now. We live in Marshall and I both know this, not religiously, but we both know this, is that beer, United States beer used to be thought of as cheap swill, right? Yeah. Domestic beer. And now it's completely changed it's a highly diversified product. There's so many different versions of it. And so this corn being cheapening is, it's such an old philosophy of beer making. There are so many brewers today that make excellent examples of what we call like light beer or these cream ales or things like that are just delicious.
Yeah.
And they use these ingredients, and there's no shame in that.
I'm almost certain, if you look at a box of Bud Light, I don't know if they're still doing this marketing campaign, but recently at least, the side of the box of Bud Light would say water, barley, hops, rice.
Yep. And no yeast, Marshall.
Yeah, no yeast. I wonder why they left that off there, but the fact that they were advertising rice, I thought was, hey, at least they're owning it. I'm not a fan of Bud Light, but I'll tell you, I love Miller Lite, and I believe Miller Lite is known for using a portion of corn as opposed to rice. And if you compare, I challenge anybody who doesn't have their head up their butt to do this. Go compare a Bud Light and a Miller Lite, and I swear Miller Lite has a fuller malt character to it than either Bud Light or Coors Light, if we're talking about the three domestic big light lagers in America. And I've always wondered, is that a part of the reason I prefer Miller Lite over the other ones? Because it does, to me, have this fuller malt character, which I really enjoy.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, I think that there's a reason they're both doing those things. They're probably for, just business reasons. There could be flavor reasons, being true to type against batches, or it's their supply chain. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. I think corn has such a history in United States brewing that the flavor you're getting and the taste you're getting it's got to be related to that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, I admit to getting a bit caught up in the whole hoity-toity side of brewing when I first got into it, and because of that, I avoided using corn for a number of years. I've since abandoned those old ways of thinking and have since brewed with corn many times, always including a portion in my cream ale batches. What impact was it having? Well, that's exactly what you aim to find out, Andy, in a recent experiment that you performed. Results from that when we're back from this break. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAV experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. We know very well that one's expectations have a huge influence on their perception. There's nothing necessarily bad about this. It's just a normal part of the human condition. I won't lie, the first time I made a cream ale, which was over a decade ago, I was convinced that I picked up a subtle corny note from the Flaked Maize. Not that I didn't enjoy it, but my palate, I wondered, was my palate accurate? Was I misperceiving this? Was my mind playing tricks on me? That's exactly what you tested out in a recent experiment, Andy.
Yeah. So I wanted to look at cream ale, and specifically not cream ale, but specifically, is corn impacting, our perception of the beer? And then we wanted to, just test that. So just Flaked Maize in one beer and then just 100% barley malt in the other. So for this experiment, we start just 2 5-gallon batches. One batch was made with 100% pale malt, while the other was made with 79% pale malt and 21% Flaked Maize.
So already you are going a bit higher than that kind of recommended 10% that you see on a lot of websites. And I think the point for this, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on this were, but we really wanted to test out, can people perceive a corn aroma flavor or some impact on mouthfeel when used in a decent charge, a decent amount of Flaked Maize?
Yeah. And we've done, this is something we've done in the past. It's when we do experiments where we try to isolate a variable. It's not just to say, hey, 5 or 10% matters. 20% should be showing up. That's a significant portion of a grain bill, right? If it was 20% dark malt, you would see it, right? So we're talking. I would think so. So we want to really push it and then see where the panel ends up,
right?
So after, that's the recipe. So that was going to be the only change for this recipe, the one A/B comparison. So for my brewing process, I do full volume, all-in-one Brewzilla setup. So these are 8-gallon-ish, total max size in 110-volt systems. I'm going to mash, single infusion mash, 152 Fahrenheit or 67 Celsius for 60 minutes. When they were complete, I removed the grains and proceeded to boil for 60 minutes. This was only one addition of hops right at the beginning, single 28-gram addition of Hallertau middle fruit at 60 minutes.
Which I think is important, right? Our point was, does the flaked maize, a grain, a cereal grain, does that have an impact on the flavor? I've seen some cream ale recipes that have later hop additions. I think typically, just to kind of point this out, if you're going to do that, you might want to go with something subtle, a noble hop or even cluster. I think was pretty classically used in cream ale. So, but we made the decision to stick with 1 ounce or 28 gram, Hallertau middle fruit hop addition just for bittering, just to emphasize the any impact that the flaked maize might have on these beers.
Yeah. And then, after those boil is over, worts were chilled and racked into sanitized Delta brewing firm tanks, and we ended up with both worts at 1048 OG.
So that's interesting to me. I would have expected, my personal expectation when I've used, based on, my experiences using corn, is that I do get a couple more points out of it. Now, again, 21% flaked maize, you would expect to see some difference here, but you nailed the same exact original gravity, which I don't know. I found that interesting. Maybe it speaks to the hotness of the malt that we're using nowadays. Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure on that. And I haven't done a rigorous analysis. I use a refractometer. I think there's about 1 point variation in that over time. I've noticed it just lifting and putting the slip cover back up and down.
Oh, sure.
And so I think there's probably that was captured there. Now, if I went in higher percentages, I think we would see more of it. But I think we were kind of in the error bars of that measurement. So
interesting nonetheless. But it's kind of nice to know that we started both of these off at the same original gravity. Yeah,
exactly. So then for fermentation, I pitched a single pouch of Imperial yeast L17 Harvest into each batch. I picked Imperial Harvest as a lager strain, though we know it can work over multiple temperature ranges, to try to recreate that. It's a cream ale, which has a hybrid yeast. So I wanted to do that as well.
Yeah.
To that point, I wanted to ferment these beers on the cooler end at 59 Fahrenheit or 15 degrees C for 5 days. And then I raised them up to 68 or 20 degrees Celsius, and then another week, just to make sure they're all completed. Yeah.
And a point on the fermentation temperature and the yeast selection for cream ale. People pointed out, I believe, after you published this article, Andy, that, that's just more like a Pilsner because you're using a lager yeast just fermented a little bit warmer. Well, that's what makes this a hybrid. Now Kolsch relies on an ale yeast fermented slightly cool, and that's also a hybrid to create more of a lager like beer. But just to be clear, if you read about the history of cream ale, it is I believe that historically it was fermented with lager yeast. So that was the reason we selected that. And 59 degrees Fahrenheit is about 10 degrees warmer than recommended traditional lager fermentation temperatures. Again, this is a cream ale. This is a hybrid style.
Yeah. And I think a lot of these beers all come from a similar genesis of thoughts and processing in German brewing. So we're not surprised to hear that we're borrowing and trading things from similar places.
Exactly.
Right? These are all in the same root. So after fermentation, I measured their finishing gravities. The all barley beer finished at 1006 versus flaked maize at 1005.
Yeah, not terribly surprising. A 1 specific gravity point difference in the end that's not something that I'm going to worry about.
Nope.
Do I think it was likely a function of the variable? I do. It makes sense to me that the flaked maize batch fermented out just slightly more than the all barley malt batch. And we do, again, I'll say it again, barley malt is hot these days. We know that.
Yeah.
And so that this doesn't surprise me too much. I might have actually expected the flaked maize batch to be a bit lower.
I would have put money on maybe even 2 points difference, but 1 point with our measurement techniques, I think is where I would, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not, if it would be higher now, I'd be like, interesting. Now I'd be really scratching my head, but lower makes sense. So at this point, I racked the beers into, I pressure transferred the beers to CO2 purged kegs, placed in a keezer, and allowed those to condition for a few weeks before I got testing myself.
Yeah, unfortunately, COVID happened, and so this was during the times when we couldn't go out and collect data from other people. And so what we did is our COVID-19, triangle test protocol where we test ourselves out. Andy, what this meant for you was filling 4 cups, 2 with one beer, 2 with beer from the other batch, marking the bottoms of 2 of them so you can later identify them. Now, we did use the same opaque colored cups, but they were all 4 the same color. And then you randomize those and you select 3. The beauty behind this approach, even though it is the completely biased brewer who's doing the triangle test, the beauty is that you are randomizing which beer is the odd one out,
Yes.
so because you don't know, and when one cup gets low, you top it off, and we tried to approach this as best we can given the crappy circumstances we were in. So
yeah, and I would say, for this record, if you're listening back on this one, this sounds odd given what you've read in the articles, but I think this is a great way to test yourself at home.
Yes.
When you can't, you might not have someone else around and you really want to do an A/B comparison, use this. This is a great technique.
Not only that, I think it's kind of fun. If you're a home brewer, you like geeking out on this stuff, test yourself. Test some of the presumptions that you hold about brewing process stuff. And anybody can do this. And so that was why we selected this particular protocol. This approach was because we did want to keep doing this stuff and provide, entertaining information at the very least. And I feel like it was a pretty solid approach. Anyways, what we did was we would do 10 trials ourselves, out of which you would have to select seven times. You'd have to be right on the triangle test. Again, the odd beer out in this format is always randomized, so you don't know which one. If you've got the single cup is the flaked maize batch, or if it's the all barley batch, we don't know that. Which again, that's one of the bonuses of doing it this way. But you have to select the correct, the odd beer out 7 out of the 10 times in order for us to say that with some level of confidence that this was a significant result. And in the end, you only selected the odd beer out how many times, Andy?
Yeah, 3 times. So not significant. So pretty wrong. I was pretty wrong. I was, we go in blind, and what's cool, this is a cool thing, right? So when we go out on the field, people don't even know what we're testing, right? They have no idea what's coming in. So I already know what's coming in. So maybe I'm expecting something. I'm already very prejudiced to these beers, and I cannot tell a difference. These beers, tasted clean, crisp. I add a little bit of that. Even that 60-minute bittering addition provides a little bit of aroma, nice floral aroma on the beer. Nice, clean, crisp. It was just a great beer, period.
The most shocking piece of this to me, and I'm going to be honest, I've not done such a rigorous comparison myself, but I've done some similar stuff in the past prior to the whole brewlosophy thing being being out there, and I had the same experience. I was shocked with my inability to not be able to detect the corniness on my nose, on my palate, or in the body of the beer. It just had no impact, which leaves you with some. You have to question some stuff, like why are we using corn anyways? Then, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think I see a lot of things, right? A lot of beer, there's a lot of history, a lot of passed down, a lot of generational things, and corn being an ingredient. It's existed for hundreds of years. It's going to be used. It was used in that style, and that style is still relevant. It's going to be used again. That's why we're using it. But I want to say one place I think we're seeing it is how corn is processed today versus how it was processed 100 years ago, 200 years ago. I would suspect that the corn we're making today is a little blander, a little cleaner than it had been. And I think that's why the flavor isn't carrying through as much. Now, 20%, maybe we could use more. Maybe we'll see it at higher percentages, of course. But I do think part of it is how it's made and how these ingredients we're using exist in today's brewing environment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. There is also one other place where the flaked maize did have a noticeable impact on your beers, and that was in just the way they looked, right? I mean, the corn did not contribute as much color as the all barley malt.
And we would expect that from, though we weren't getting much of an OG difference, color's a lot more subtle, and we can pick that up with our eyes a lot better than the, gravity measurements, right, that have a little bit more error to them. The subtle color, especially at the lighter end of the Lovabond scale, when we see it, it's a little different. And, versus using something like Lovabond of 2 or 3, corn being below 1, I mean, that impact should be quite visible, and it was in this case.
Yes. Yeah. You go look at the picture on the article, and you do see a visual difference, which on its own, to me, is a good thing. That's what you want in a cream ale. You want it to be as pale as possible, to be as approachable, almost water-like in appearance, right? One thing the results of this experiment made me think, and we've done other flaked maize experiments in the past as well that I think are very interesting. What happens when you use, because corn is often used, again, one of the reasons people suggest using it for is to, reduce the body of a beer, to increase that snappiness, that crispness on the palate. Well, what happens when you use 15 to 20% flaked maize in, say, a double IPA that has one is going to have just more body because of the sheer amount of pale malt or whatever your base malt is you're using, but then also might have other malts in it that don't ferment out as well. Some crystal malts, some Munich malt or something in it. What impact then does that corn have? I would imagine that the delta in mouthfeel stuff, that experience, that delta is greater there. That's just an utter guess and something perhaps for future experimentation. But
absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you look at corn, if you were to refine it and everything, you get corn sugar, and that's where you're just drying things out, trying to add no flavor, no color. I would imagine if you're using it 20%, it's 20% of a beer that's bigger to begin with, right? We're only at around 1048. Now go to 1068. Now that corn is just going to be a whole more weight experience to the beer. Yeah. And I have to believe there could be something. So it would be good to look at that in the future for sure.
Yeah. Or another one, when I've brewed beers using Mecca Great Estate, these craft, very rich flavored craft malts, when I've brewed beers using 100%, for example, La Manta or Pelton, their base malts, I perceive a greater mouthfeel. I get more richness, more fullness. Well, perhaps, I think you used a standard pale malt that's out there, one of the big maltsters, if you will.
Yep.
And again, they're known for producing these really hot malts because that is what brewers want, and it's a great thing. But what happens when you're using a craft malt that may not be as hot necessarily? Will it have a greater impact? Just so many questions that this leads to. The biggest one for me is towards you, Andy. Are you going to continue using flaked maize in your cream ale?
Yeah, I think I will. I kind of want to do one of two things. One is maybe go to higher percentages just to see what happens to the body, to the back end, right? To modify what I get from pale malt. Yeah. The other one is to try to look at other craft. Does craft maize exist, right? Go to other producers of malt, of maize and stuff. And one thing that happened, especially in the last few years with the rise of hazy IPA, was looking at non-barley ingredients.
That's right.
To add haze, chit malt, oat malt, all these other ways of adding a haze, a permanent, polyphenolic or other type of haze to the beer. And I think what you'll see is that these other non-barley adjuncts are going to become popular for people to want to play around with them. And then I think over time you'll find the flavor of those will develop. You'll get something that isn't quote unquote DMS in the beer. And we'll find a new place for these flavors that are a little more, let's say for lack of a better term, heritage ingredients.
Sure. And I'm with you. I will absolutely continue using flaked maize, and I doubt I'll ever use grits because I don't want to have to do a cereal mash. Flaked maize was invented for a reason. Let's use it for that.
Let's go. Yeah.
But I'm also not convinced, this is a single data point and all that stuff, but I'm not convinced that if you don't, if you throw so much corn at it, you'll likely taste it. I mean, I'm not saying that's not the case, but at 21%, it didn't seem to have much of an impact on a cream ale, which it's known to be used in, on aroma, flavor, or mouthfeel. And I think that's really interesting. And I think it's worth pointing out, corn is cheaper than most barley malts. It does serve a purpose by not contributing to that stuff in beer, even if somebody swears that they taste corn when it's, do a triangle test. Test it out for yourself, see what you think. So, again, I will absolutely be using flaked maize in my brewing, even though these experiment results were non-significant. And I do think it's interesting. One other experiment that I'd like to see after chatting with you on this episode now, Andy, is a comparison of flaked maize, maybe like 20% flaked maize in a cream ale versus dextrose, 20% dextrose in place of them. Yeah. So the malt would be exactly the same there. But does flaked maize contribute some other perceptible characteristics versus corn sugar, right? I just think that'd be interesting. So.
That'd be interesting, yeah. And if you read the history of cream ale, they did use corn sugar, so it's cool to think about all these different ways of adding stuff, though you make it to the same numbers quantitatively, right? The qualitative aspect, how you would perceive the beer could be drastically different.
Absolutely. Interesting stuff. Well, we got a couple of reader comments we want to get to. The first one comes from, hopefully I say this right, Jürgen DeFern, who says, there's a tendency for people to think that sugars and corn are used to cheapen the brew. But that is only a rather recent historic consequence. Until the time between the wars, corn and sugar were more expensive for British brewers than using barley. And yet you see them used in the 19th century in many kinds of beer recipes, sometimes with more expensive processes like boiling maize grits. Martin Cornell and Ron Pattinson, shout out to those guys, very, very cool people, prove that many stories coming out of the U.S. craft and homebrew community need to be taken with a very large grain of salt. Amen, Jürgen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's these things get quote unquote expensive or inexpensive due to scale, right? How much are they being used?
Yeah.
And look with at the top of the show, the feedback about agriculture and how things cost. I mean, yeah, high quality goods cost money, right? We got to use them. So only over time do these things become commodities and become cheap to be used. So I think what we'll see going forward, especially as craft malt picks up, is craft adjunct ingredients, right? I think you're going to find better, interesting, more flavors, specifically actually in gluten-free brewing.
Yeah.
Malted rice is becoming a huge deal. And I've had some excellent gluten-free beers that are really challenged to brew and taste like beer, and I was really impressed.
Yeah, I really want to try a good gluten-free. I had someone reach out and offer to send. I've not had I think I've had one gluten-free beer, but it was like 6 years ago, and it was made from sorghum syrup, and it was awful.
A local Ventura independent beer enthusiast, Jeff, makes an excellent gluten-free beer with malted rice. I'll bring some.
Oh yeah, I got to try that. Also, by the way, TIL. I had no idea that corn was ever more expensive than barley, so I appreciate learning that. Yeah, that is really interesting. The next reader comment is actually a question for you, or I guess for us, Andy. William A says, "Do you think the IBU level maybe had something to do with your experiment not being significant?" And just to point out, the IBU of this beer was only 12.7, so that's pretty low.
Yeah, I mean, in general, these variables, when we run these, there's so many variables, and we want to make a beer that makes sense, follows a style guideline, right? So when we modify something, we're playing within a style and then pushing it. And so if it had less IBU, would it make the flavor more pronounce whatever flavors are modifying, or would it be higher? I mean, it's possible, but we wanted to be within realistic style guidelines of the beer too. So I would say I'm not thinking it's going to have an impact, or it may have distracted from the flavor, but it's possible. It's just, what kind of beer do you want to make? At 20 IBUs, I wonder how. I think, well, I like hops, so I would still find this beer very drinkable, but maybe not someone else. So it's a good question though.
Yeah, no, I understand the kind of knee jerk reaction to a non-significant result as being looking for potential explanations other than it just didn't have an impact. Yeah. I also understand thinking that bitterness will in some way overpower a flavor difference. I don't think that's accurate though. Flavor is something that is so it's a gestalt. There's so many things going on with flavor. Yes, bitterness might distract somebody mentally. This is, again, my own opinion. I could see bitterness kind of being distracting to somebody looking for a flavor difference, but I don't see it as necessarily usurping any differences in flavor, if that makes any sense. I feel like you'd still be able to taste a 20% flaked maize beer from one that had no flaked maize at all if it was having a flavor impact. Plus, again, barely 13 IBU. I mean, that is not a bitter beer. So
yeah.
But a great question, William. And again, I do understand the desire to want to be able to explain away results like this. And it's why we continue to repeat these experiments. So final comment comes from Reddit user Strange Scarcity, who says, "You're likely going to frown upon this, but I made a joke series of beers once. The joke was making fun of the big guys, and I made the faux king of champagne ales." I'm going to go ahead and guess that is the champagne of beers mock there. With more than 50% flaked corn. Wow. It actually turned out tasty. Go figure. No, it was not a lager. It almost tasted like corn pop cereal. I later made another version, Faux King Awesome Caramel Ale, and it carried caramel corn pops flavor to it. For jokes, they came out pretty darn tasty.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, at some point you have to taste it, right? If it was 100% corn, it would have a very different flavor than the 20% corn, 50% corn. So interesting that he actually perceived it as corn. I would wonder if they perceived it as corn. I wonder, is it your preconceived notions when you go in to drink it, right? If you would be given that blind with 2 or 3 other beers, would it still taste corny? I always wonder that, right? You go in expecting a flavor, but maybe it's some notions, but you could always try it yourself, and you could say, hey, I did 3 beers all blind, and this one tasted this way or something. So it's interesting.
I'm with you, obviously. I'm with you on that, Andy. And I really it upsets me a little that people get offended when we question something that occurs to all of us, and that is that expectation guides our perception. We know that happens. It's been studied for hundreds of years, in the field that I'm in. You knew that it was made with 50% corn and it tasted like corn pops. That doesn't surprise me. I'm not questioning anyone's palate, strange scarcity, but it's possible that your perception of corn pops was because of your awareness that it was made with 50% corn. But regardless, I love the happy little accident, right? I mean, that's exactly what the whole Short and Shoddy series came out of. I was bored one day. My wife went out shopping, and so I wanted to do a quick batch for an hour and a half, and threw together this weird batch of beer with some leftover ingredients, and it ended up being delicious. And thus was born the Short and Shoddy series. So those happy little accidents can be very influential, and I think it's cool. Thanks for sharing that story. I would actually like to try a 50% flaked corn beer at some point.
Yeah. That'd be sound. I mean, that you're only a couple steps away from whiskey at that point. So.
Well, you got to distill it, right? First, and then
of course,
age it a little bit. All right, dude. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode. Any last words on using flaked maize or corn in cream ale?
I mean, I think go for it. If you're worried about the flavor, at least for me, I was not picking a ton of it up. If I was getting any, I would try more. But yeah, I mean, these are interesting experiments. These are classic styles. I think every home brewer should at least know what these things taste like before they go off the deep end into other styles. You should try these basic beers and revisit them. And I mean, there's great books. We've had great books for more than a decade now on how to brew these beers, and great examples online. So I think just give them a shot at least once and see what you think. I think if you especially have a preconceived notion that these beers will taste a certain way, well, brew them and see what you find out.
Exactly. And to spin off of what you were saying, also, before you develop a negative perspective of certain ingredients, try them out. Test for yourself. Don't go based off of what you're reading online or even what we're writing. Try it out, see for yourself, and at the very end, the very worst, you're going to have a keg of beer for yourself to drink. So, well, don't forget to check out our newest podcast, The Brew Lab, where host Cade Job takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss fascinating research they've completed on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.